Yeah, hi, I'm Mari.
Daryl. I'm Jeff.
I'm Aiden.
We are the military strategy group.
So, opening up, quick summary of our current situation. Yeah, so the current situation in both Korea and Japan is we have a very robust military relationship. In Korea, we have Combined Forces Command, which is a U.S. and Republic of Korea combined defensive organization. And it reports directly to the National Security Councils of both nations. We conduct exercises, we have combined defense planning. Essentially, there's a huge military relationship here that's very helpful there. In the United States and Japan, it's also very robust. However, the Japanese Constitution forbids an offensive military, so they call it the Japanese Civil Defense Forces. But again, we have multiple treaties, alliances, exercises. So the military combination is very, very robust as far as strategy goes. Next slide, please. However, it does still lead. There's a lot of motivation for proliferation in the region. The biggest thing was the retirement of the Tomahawk land attack missile. That was what those two nations considered as the American umbrella for them, and that was retired in the 90s. There's nothing in the region that delivers.
Tied into Obama.
Initially, it was completed then, yes. That's when it was finished. So it has no, there's nothing physically in the region as compared to NATO. While closely partnered, Republic of Korea and Japan have no say in U.S. nuclear deployment. They can request, they can beg, they can plead, but there's no written system in which they can request the use that will authorize it. DPRK continues its aggression and posturing in the region. Additionally, the People's Republic of China is aggressively controlling the exclusive economic zone in the East China Sea, which both Japan and South Korea have claims to. And with China being a nuclear state, it leads to more motivation for them as well. And above the military strategy is also geopolitical events, which leads them to lose a little bit of faith in our umbrella. So the big concern is they're both technologically savvy nations with robust nuclear infrastructures that can be directed toward that proliferation very quickly. Right. So ultimately, if we are to ensure that the Republic of Korea and Japan do not feel the need to develop their own nuclear weapons, they have to be convinced that we essentially have got their back and that our nuclear weapons are good enough for them. So when we look at this, we need to make sure that they believe we have the capability, that we are actually committed to doing so in a timely fashion, and that we have the preparation, we have the training, we have all of the logistical support necessary to actually take this to our opponents should deterrence fail, essentially. So one of our options that we would like to propose first, we need to increase the amount of Japan and Republic of Korea planning involved in this. So the essential notion here is that if we go to them and say, yes, we have a strategy for deterring and defeating your opponent should you be attacked, but we don't tell them what that is, this is not as convincing as them participating in the process ahead of time. So we need to have a method of creating a target list that both Japan, North Korea, and the United States agree is viable and effective at deterring. The system has to be consonant with the law of armed conflict if we are to have any credibility to actually executing this. If we'd like to have some notion of what the allied abilities that they can bring and what they're prepared to tolerate, because we have to expect that there would be losses if there were an actual shooting war. And one of the things that the planning process should really enhance is the notion of this is what we're looking at if you want to employ weapons, if you want either nuclear or conventional. So really tying them in and bringing them into a sense of this is how it would happen, this is the sense of participation, this is why you can believe in this. We could further go to the point of redeploying weapons in Japan, or correction, redeploying in South Korea, deploying for the first part in Republic of Korea, very similar to what we have in NATO today. So more than just a bomb, one has to have delivery mechanisms capable of penetrating the airspace of the whatever country likely DPRK, in order to actually hold the targets at risk. So you have to have the munitions support squadrons in place if you want to have them there. So there is a large logistics footprint and a large amount of adjunct hardware that would have to be brought about. Probably end up fielding more dual-capable F-35s in both Japan and the Republic of Korea. We have to figure out what sort of delivery role each nation would have. In NATO, we do have burden sharing for delivery, and this again helps strengthen the alliance by the necessary actions of load sharing. We would have to figure out what we are doing in terms of our participation and what checks we have on nuclear use, and of course, we have to have the political apparatus to coordinate and do the final authorization. And certainly in NATO, it would be from all the participating countries before release is authorized. And last part, demonstrations that we can encourage, that we have a greater commitment to Japan and the Republic of Korea. So right now, Daryl, you want to comment on our Korean?
Right now, what we have in Korea is it's about a brigade combat team size of combat elements in aviation. So it's about 8,000 fighting soldiers. The rest are within headquarters units, support units, and other things. Their main mission is really non-combatant evacuation, not war fighting. If something were to occur, we'd bring forces onto the peninsula. So, and this is a recent change in the size of troops. The mid-2000s, the early teens, flew out of Korea and out of Europe. So again, that made them concerned because they thought of it as a less of a commitment on our behalf. So increasing that commitment would, increase our ties. And with that, it's kind of, we threw this out there, accompanied tours, and that's when soldiers bring their families with them. It's one thing to put soldiers on the peninsula, it's another thing to put families there. You know, we kind of say jokingly, our soldiers are kind of hostages. Putting their families there makes them a lot more valuable hostages, and it shows that we really, really care about this. We're not going to put our own women and children with our soldiers there unless we really believe that this is something we believe in that we're going to protect. And I think that's more of an emotional and contact that we can make, but that commitment would be very helpful.
Excuse me, did you serve in Korea?
I've been there many times, never been stationed there, but I've done a lot of exercise.
Active duty?
Yes.
Army?
Yes.
All right. And above the military strategy, we just have to, there's, I think, a perception at least, or possible reality, that the United States is moving into a period of isolationism. And when dealing with deterrence, the perception of that isolationism is as damning as any reality could be. So we need to make sure that on higher political levels, the rhetoric and the message is consistently that the United States is prepared to support, will support, and is committed to its treaty obligations. And this is not strictly a military operation, but it does support the effectiveness of any military option. So, future work?
Yeah, so going forward, we're planning on doing open source analysis of North Korean order of battle, figure out what they had, especially artillery units and capabilities near the demilitarized zone, and projected integrated air defense system capabilities, just because obviously this will affect any sort of military action if it comes to that, or military tactics. So also we're planning on doing open source analysis of Japanese and Korean weapon delivery capabilities, because even if they develop weapons, their delivery is also very relevant to our response. And we also will be doing an open source analysis of Korean and Japanese perception of U.S. military activities, so we can integrate all that into our suggestions. And that is the end of our presentation.
I'm sorry, in there, was there embedded in there, oh, you do have the DPRK order of battle.
Yeah.
Any questions?
Good, I like the direction.
And what's an open source analysis?
Open source intelligence is anything that you can get from the internet, from James, things like that, non-government sources.
Can you just go back a couple slides? There was something. Yeah. The building confidence part, maybe it was one. Also credibility. Okay. So I guess it'd be interesting to get your thoughts on what technically could be done to bolster credibility, and also what should be avoided if you don't want to inhibit credibility or weaken it. Have you guys thought about this? Is it on the technical side?
So,
I'm trying to understand what you mean by technically.
So in terms of, the technical aspect, in terms of guaranteeing that our weapons would work, the stockpiled stewardship. This seems the sort of matter that if you send their scientist over here and you can say at the, the unclass, or maybe, ideally the unclass, maybe the RD if we're prepared to read people in level, and say, here is the research, here's what we've done, here is why we believe this will work. If you take them out to the test site and then look at all the various subcritical experiments. And then at the same time, you also have to say, okay, here are our delivery mechanisms. Here are when we exercise these capabilities. These are the performance and readiness rates that we are showing for the B-2 bomber, for Alchem at the moment. These delivery platforms can say, yes, we have the technical capability, so if we have the will to use it, it will work.
That's just to be clear, that would be, and I think it's an interesting idea. It would be a major paradigm shift, particularly in interaction with Japan, if they were one of the nations that you were looking at, which they are. They've actually kind of officially up to this point stood off from our nuclear capabilities. In fact, they have prohibitions. Any of the technology that we do that we connect to them is, if it's dual use, they're not supposed to be a part of it.
Mm-hmm.
So suggesting that they could have access at some level to either restricted data or even just to officially use only sort of documentation would be an interesting paradigm shift. And I wonder if they would be up to that. So I think that's a neat idea. I just want to say that it's really different than what we've had up to this point on the technical side. They've kept us at arm's length, actually.
I think we'd have to do a more thorough read of the Atomic Energy Act to see if that was even a legally within the realm.
You could find ways to do this. We can be far more open with U.S. academics than we can with Japanese, because the Japanese don't want us to be open with them. That's really honestly what goes on now. So it's just interesting to hear that as an idea. Thank you.
There has been, you might look, and there has been, it's Article 9 of their Constitution, which stipulates the 3 no's on the nuclear side.
Right.
And there has been discussion by Prime Minister Abe and his administration about revisiting that, but it's very controversial.
It would be an interesting shift. Maybe nothing.
Manu, had you said anything?
The next webinar, I didn't just like.
Do you have anything to add?
I think they pretty much covered it. I was a party to the presentation.
Okay. Does anybody have a computer yet? Look at this.
I need to know your names when you speak up. Are you new here?
Yeah, I just joined along with Daryl.
What?
Yeah.
You're not listed on here. You're just below.
Yeah. Just like
What is your name?
Matt Marshall.
You're a nuclear engineer?
Yes.
Graduate student?
Yes. I do like the USB.
No,
It-
but you did it.
Oh, just to get it out there.
It's my 60, so it's like. So how does-
We have a USB-C connector, but I have mine.
So you have-
So it's not a source.
I can take it from
So you want-
Oh, we got it. Sarah, we got it.
Huh? Yeah, I know.
So.
Okay. We're the weapons design group.
Give your name, please.
I'm Matt. I guess we can all just go through and say our names real quickly. I'm Mitch. You may. Bill.
I'm Adria.
Joseph. I'm Daniel. And so here we're just going to present what we've been working on in the weapons design group.
Okay, so we're just going to do a quick overview of all the slides we're going through. This is a quick outline. First, we're going to talk about the objective, like as the weapons design group, what we're going to cover on this presentation. We're going to talk about the types of weapons or types of weapon designs that are out there that these countries could pursue, South Korea and Japan. We're going to talk about the materials that they have access to or the type of material they can receive for creating these weapons. We're going to talk about related technologies for like deployment or other things that are necessary to create the nuclear weapon. And we're going to talk about covert attempts, which is basically like essentially the nuclear program history within these two countries. And with all that coming together, we're going to talk about policy recommendation based off our information or what we thought was important as a group. Okay, so our general objective is to provide information for what kind of nuclear weapons these countries can pursue or what is most feasible and more likely for these countries. And based on that, we're going to provide some sort of recommendation on the design and construction, just based on the equipment they have available, what they can get done quickly, and like the processes they would go through to get that launched.
All right, so I'm going to talk very quickly about just the large overview of the different weapon designs. I know Dr. Bernstein's addressed that already in brief, and a lot of us are kind of trying to weave between what's classified and what's not. So I'm sticking to safe ground and just going with what's been presented. But I'll paint a bullseye on myself. If people, as we're going through this, have more questions, I can work with you individually. So basically, the little boy is the gun type. So it's one of the two standard types. It's technologically a little bit easier initially. So it's simpler than the implosion type, but it's not simple. So there are a lot of details that we haven't addressed specifically. You get a little bit of a sense of that with all the various details on the right, like the arming and firing, fusing, rendering the weapon safe. So things that we haven't really talked about in details due to the time constraints. So there's a lot to it. So they're typically they use uranium. Highly enriched, and so plutonium is not typically viable for the gun types because it basically just has too much of a neutron flux, and so you get basically a premature detonation, also known as a fizzle. So it's just much harder to do plutonium. So for the plutonium type, it's implosion. As we talked about, as the density increases, that gives you a dramatic increase in your effective yield. So implosion types are more effective, more efficient, I guess you could say, per unit mass, but they're much more complicated. So timing of the conventional explosives to compress everything in almost a perfectly timed implosion in 3 dimensions is extremely difficult. So it takes advanced electronics, advanced timing, advanced explosives, high level industry to make these things work. And also, just bear in mind that we talk about 2 main types, but it's kind of phase locked in our culture that there are 2 main types, and so it's possible that other people could come up with new designs that we haven't thought of. So I'll just throw that out there to not get blinded into what's been done already.
As we've learned in this class, you can't just pick up like plutonium or uranium. Most uranium-238, not really good for weapons. You gotta turn it into 235. Plutonium's entirely man-made. So how are these countries gonna get the material that they're gonna use in these weapons? For uranium, you can use reactors. You can enrich it to weapons grade. And both South Korea and Japan have a lot of nuclear reactors. So it's both entirely possible for them to get weapons grade uranium-235 from their reactors, although those sites are monitored by the International Atomic Energy Agency. Plutonium, a little bit more interesting. South Korea has no access to plutonium, but Japan does. That's because Japan's allowed to do a thing called reprocessing, where they take their spent fuel rods and extract plutonium from them. And South Korea is not allowed to do that. So there's a bit of a discrepancy between what South Korea and Japan are allowed to do. Interestingly enough, South Korea is now building reactors for the United Arab Emirates. And now that they're building reactors for other countries, they're starting to question their status in regards to the treaty they signed with the US, which disallows them for reprocessing. And they're wanting to do reprocessing now. So under the status quo, Japan can get plutonium, but South Korea cannot. But in the next couple of years, with that agreement in flux, it's entirely possible that South Korea begins to reprocess as well, and then they'll have access to plutonium as well. Additionally, we talked briefly about laser isotope separation, and South Korea has no access to that, but Japan actually has an active laser isotope separation facility, which they can use to get plutonium and enrich uranium.
Right.
So, let me just go back. Is it okay if I?
Can you save it for the end?
Okay.
All right, so other than the nuclear material that you need, there are a lot of other things that go into a nuclear weapon. And so Bill sort of mentioned this earlier when he was talking about advanced technologies that you need. So outside of the weapon, you need things for launching a weapon if you want it to be a missile or anything from uranium fabrication for subcritical components of your weapon to arming your weapon, as well as actually firing the weapon and not having it detonate prematurely. And delivery vehicles are all important technologies that we're going to be looking into because these are things that you could also restrict. And if you can monitor the spread of those technologies, it's one other barrier that, as Professor Bernstein mentioned, putting up barriers is how you can prevent weapons, other than just limiting people's access to the nuclear.
So now I'll talk a bit about the historical context that will go on to inform what our final policy proposal will be. So starting with South Korea, in the 1970s, under 3 US administrations, the Nixon, Ford, and Carter administrations, they wanted to plan withdrawal of US ground troops, and this actually prompted then President Park of South Korea to initiate a covert weapons research/development project. So these involve different chemical separation methods as well as the successful separation of a small quantity of plutonium. And so it's quite interesting because only in 2004, under intense pressure from the IAEA, South Korea publicly disclosed these attempts, which were breaching international agreements. And now moving on to Japan. So in the 1960s, there was a US-Japan treaty. So following China's first nuclear test in 1964, there were some concerns that Japan might also want to try to start a covert weapon development. However, the parliament made a point to not manufacture, possess, or permit nuclear weapons in Japan. And in 1970, they signed an NPT with the US. So South Korea did have a covert weapons program that continued in the 1970s to 80s, whereas Japan, there is no information about if they had nuclear weapons.
So there was an initiative by Prime Minister Nakasone in the mid-90s to study a covert capability, but it was stopped. It was when Clinton was president, Nakasone was Prime Minister of Japan. It didn't get beyond the study phase.
So this is a preliminary analysis. We started going through the different countries to figure out what type of nuclear capabilities they had. So we looked at their different facilities. These are some of the research reactors that we found, or like natural power reactors that we found that South Korea has. And we also looked at the ones for Japan as well. Let's go through each one just as an overview of what they currently have. And so we're trying to understand what capabilities do they have based on the facilities that they have. So based on this, we decided to make a couple policy recommendations. So to go through these, basically, the first one, basically, how can we strengthen like the nuclear umbrella, like the U.S.'s protection for North and South Korea, to ensure that they are not leaning towards how can we create weapons based on the perceived threat, which is from North Korea. Next, we said that we can instill continuous monitoring of each of their facilities, and we're planning on obviously looking more into that to see if that's not already something that's going on. And finally, we were saying that we can increase the difficulty of withdrawing from the NPT because we realize that there are a couple loopholes that allow them to. And so if we can basically tighten up these loopholes, that would really be helpful with countries that decide that they will withdraw from this.
So on that point, you need to look at the additional protocol of the NPT, the additional protocol of the NPT, okay, which was established after North Korea withdrew from the NPT, to make it more difficult to withdraw.
And that's it.
All right. Can we get the next group setting up while there are questions?
Yes,
Go ahead.
So just one thing that you made as a statement earlier about uranium coming from reactors. It's not quite that. Uranium is used in reactors. Reactors don't actually produce uranium. They produce plutonium.
Centrifuges.
Yeah. Right. A centrifuge will produce enriched uranium. And so it's the presence of highly enriched uranium.
I think the idea is that they have the nuclear material there, like the raw material, and from there they can actually go on to try to enrich it into covert operations or.
So it's just that I just want to make sure that you do get that. Reactors do not make uranium. But
right.
Still struggling with basics.
Yeah.
Please give us your names.
Hey everyone, we're the Economic Sanctions Group. I'm Jesse.
I'm Anirudh or
Jessica.
And Han.
So we're just going to do a quick overview of the topics that we're going to cover today. So first we're going to talk about the multilateral economic sanctions enforced by international regulatory bodies, for example, the World Trade Organization, the United Nations, the IAEA. Also, we're going to be examining the free trade agreements that exist between the United States and South Korea. So currently, no free trade agreements exist between the United States and Japan. We're also going to be talking about discontinuing weapons trade with South Korea and Japan, and talking about the Iran nuclear deal and its its implications as to our relations with South Korea and Japan.
So like Jessica mentioned, U.S. and South Korea currently has free trade agreement that was entered into force in 2012. And as of 2016, there's a trade deficit of $17 billion. So Korea is making a lot of money off of this agreement right now. And most of the deficit is coming from Korean vehicles and machinery. Whereas U.S. is selling services like travel and intellectual property. And President Trump has recently said something about selling $11 billion worth of weapons to South Korea. But that is probably improbable. And another thing that we're looking at is military involvements in weapons trade in South Korea and Japan. So we're trying to look at so we're trying to put dollar values of U.S. military bases in South Korea and Japan. And in a case that we put an economic sanction on either country, it is likely that we have to move out of those countries. And another thing is, in case that Korea and Japan are proliferating nuclear weapons, how would they, buy weapons like fighter jets and missiles that they're currently getting from the U.S.
Our speculation is that they might go to China or Russia to obtain these weapons. And the last thing is U.S. losses from reduced arms trading with South Korea and Japan. And this is just a map of the West Pacific, and most of the U.S. troops are in South Korea and Japan right now, totaling about 60,000 troops. And there's also bases in Manila and Guam. So when there's an economic sanction, it might be necessary to move those troops.
Yeah, so I'm focusing on Japan. Unlike South Korea, the United States and Japan do not have any kind of free trade agreement, so that's not something that we could leverage. Something else we were involved with them with was the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Unfortunately, we pulled out of that back in January of 2017. That was a big partnership that involved a bunch of tariffs being removed between a bunch of member countries, and also a lot more than that. So that kind of takes away some of the larger things we could leverage with economic sanctions. But the U.S. does have a lot of different agreements with Japan. One example of that is this U.S.-Japan Nuclear Cooperation Agreement. It's of 1987, but it's been revised since then and still debate. But that involves the U.S. allowing Japan to be able to reprocess our nuclear fuel. In addition to that, in 2013, the U.S. made an agreement involving the sale of natural gas to Japan directly. And that's definitely a big thing because as of 2016, Japan could only produce 6% of the energy that they need domestically. All the other 94% they need to import. And that involves like oil, natural gas, anything you would use to produce electricity. So that's definitely something that Japan, really has to work with other people to be able to produce all the electricity it needs. So that's kind of an angle that we're going to be looking at to take with Japan.
Okay, so that's me. So I've been looking at the Iran nuclear deal, and not just the JCPOA, but also like the UN Security Council sanctions that have been imposed since like 2006 and until 2015. And also the EU regulation that was also imposed on Iran. So our hope is that we can look at the sanctions that were imposed and then come up with like sort of a similar framework, but just incorporating like the specifics of trade with Japan and South Korea into those sanctions. I didn't find as much useful information in the JCPOA as I found in the UN Security Council sanctions. And also, so this might be helpful for the weapons design group, but sanction number 1737 and 1747 talk a lot about nuclear equipment and what was like stocked in terms of like trade. I think there's almost about 40 pages worth of material. Since I'm econ, I couldn't really understand a lot of it, but I think it might be helpful for people that are nuclear engineers. So I think that would be worth looking at. So yeah, I'm just gonna go through all of them. I've gone through 1696, 1737, 1747, and 2224. And I'm going to go through the others and see how they can apply to coming up with like specific economic sanctions to Japan and South Korea. So just in terms of like what specifically they talk about, so they talk about like banking and financial services. So they have like sanctions that are like, sorry.
Again, you are addressing UN approved economic sanctions that could be invoked against Japan or South Korea if they start a nuclear weapons program.
Right. Yeah, and so that's why we looked at the other sanctions that were imposed by the Security Council and also.
And you're looking at the Iranian model.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, basically, like what they talk about a lot is banking and financial services. So if they have like specific banks that are like operating in like those countries, so you could like stop doing that. Financial services, you could also like freeze assets of like specific individuals that are from those countries, or like specific corporations that have like a large share of like trade with us, or like have a large like presence in the US, so that can be another economic sanction. And then so like again, specific industries and embargoes, like we talked about, like how the different industries with Japan and South Korea and like the amount of trade we have with them, so like putting embargoes on that. And then again, sale and supply of nuclear material, which can go with the weapons design group. Also, so transactions in like the specific currencies also can be stopped. So you could stop like doing Japanese yen or the South Korean currency, and then also like sale of currency. So like in terms of like just the market of currencies, like buying and selling currency, that can also be stopped. And then purchase of like government debt, so like the sovereign debt of South Korea and Japan, like there can be restrictions that can be put on that. Sale purchase of petroleum products, automotive products, even technical trainings that involve money and personnel, like there can be restrictions imposed on that. So with the Iran nuclear deal, there were still like humanitarian supplies were still allowed. And so if we were to come up with something for Japan and South Korea, we believe that we should still have humanitarian aid if they so need it. I don't think we plan on imposing economic sanctions on anything humanitarian aid related. Those are just some of the sources. And that is it. Are there any questions, comments, suggestions? Yeah.
When the UNSC imposes economic sanctions on a country, how do you ensure that, like, what do you do against countries that violate the sanctions?
Well, so this was what was agreed on by like 5 of the members, or like the permanent members, and also I believe all of the economic sanctions were agreed upon by the non-temporary members except one, which was Qatar, or Qatar. And so they agree upon it, and then if they don't, I don't know specifically like what happens to them if they don't do it, but then they just come out of the agreement, and like the benefits that are coming from those, like just stop. I don't know specifically like what happens if they're not compliant. Yeah.
I've heard the member states like stopping cargo ships in the middle of the ocean and searching the ship, and if there is anything going to those countries, they confiscate those.
Right.
Yeah, and like the JCPOA, so basically it was like a commission that like collectively is responsible for like making sure that like all of the states are like complying with the regulations that have been imposed. So if we were doing something similar, there would be like a specific body that's just responsible for like regulating whether all the countries or the member countries are following through on their just objectives. So yeah.
Can we get the next group up here? Next group is policy.
Okay, thank you.
All the group members up there. It doesn't, whichever you prefer. Because we have your groups from the memos.
Please give us your names before you speak.
Hi, I am Priya, and I'm from the policies group, and the other members of the team are Jacob, Marissa, Julio, and Django. So we are going to talk to you about how we framed the problem of understanding the diplomacy of the region. So first we set out about understanding the regional politics containing North Korea, South Korea, and Japan, and how they have diplomatic relations with US and Russia and China. We also have Jong-wook in our team who is from South Korea, and he is able to get a good perspective in our discussions. So in the first meeting, we decided to diverge a little to understand the politics and diplomatic situation of the area by focusing on several topics that we thought would be relevant for us to understand the region. Those topics were history of nuclear in South Korea, history of nuclear in Japan, and previous weapon treaties, what worked, what didn't, background of North Korea and South Korea conflict, and looking at game theory models and influence of Russia, China, and US on North and South Korean strategy. So based on these research, we were able to propose 3 policy proposals for our first combined class meeting last week. And the first proposal for that was US engaging in nuclear sharing with Japan. This proposal has its pros and cons. So the pros would be that, so the cons of this proposal are clearly like the structure, then if US engages in nuclear sharing with Japan, it will definitely strengthen the relation with Japan. But in the long term, we don't know how China may feel about this thing and what the long-term repercussions could be. Second proposal was strengthening current treaties by establishing multilateral treaty with South Korea and Japan, and also possibly Taiwan. This is because South Korea and Japan Both are capable of developing nuclear weapons on their own, but are not doing so because they have a strong military alliance with US. So keeping that strengthened over time may work in the benefit of US only. Our third proposal was US engaging in diplomatic talks with North Korea with goal of non-aggressive pact, and in return, eventually withdrawing its troops from South Korea slowly. So we got also, during our discussions, we also got a few pointers from other classmates about what happened during Bush administration with treaties from Korea and Japan, and that is what we look into next. So this is just a general overview of what we have looked till now, and now Jacob will guide.
Another approach that we took was a sort of a red team analysis of North Korea. The rationale behind that was that if there was a way, based on diplomacy, to eliminate the North Korean nuclear threat from the region completely, there would be no motivation anymore for South Korea and for Japan to have their own nuclear programs. So in order to do so, we tried to look at North Korea's foreign relations through their lens to try to understand North Korea's perspective. And we looked at the major events that led to the current situation of the current threat that North Korea poses. I do want to disclaim that these findings and these opinions are based off scholarly work of experts and scholars about the region, and do not necessarily represent our or my personal political views, but do propose an approach and an angle that does show a fairly critical side of the U.S. role in our current status quo. So the story begins with the Korean War in the early 50s, where U.S. generals instructed bombers to destroy almost the entire infrastructure of North Korea. As part of these bombing initiatives, major dams were targeted, which, if the Nuremberg standards of war crimes were applied to these military actions, that would be an indictable war crime and would actually, by applying the same standards, warrant the death penalty. So looking through this lens, it is not a far-fetched assumption to assume that North Korea sees the U.S. as a very aggressive player and a very hostile player. Fast forwarding a few decades, in 1993, North Korea was about to strike a deal with Israel to end missile exports to the Arab region in return for diplomatic recognition by Israel. The U.S. objected to that and pressured Israel to reject that proposal. And North Korea retaliated by carrying out its first test of a medium range missile. As a result of that, a U.S.-North Korean framework agreement was signed, which was, during the period of the 90s, mostly adhered to, and relations between the U.S. and North Korea, especially under the Clinton administration, warmed up slightly. However, when President Bush took office, George W. Bush, that strategy flipped, and the U.S. had a more aggressive and more hostile approach towards North Korea. And as a reaction, North Korea conducted more tests and led to a revival of North Korea's military missile and nuclear program. By 2006, North Korea had developed 8 to 10 nuclear weapons and had withdrawn, as we know, from the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Despite all these developments, during that time there was reason to hope. Our best chances of resolving the issue diplomatically were in 2005. A deal was negotiated between the US, China, South Korea, Japan, Russia, and North Korea that included a complete elimination of North Korea's nuclear and missile program in exchange for a non-aggression pledge by the United States and an acknowledgement of each other's sovereignty. The Bush administration undermined these efforts and eventually renewed the threat of force and also pressured banks to freeze North Korea's hard currency accounts, which had very negative economic consequences. And since then, relations have not improved. Currently, tensions and threats are extremely high under President Trump. And by looking at these reports and these analyses, one could try to make the case that most of North Korea's actions since the 50s were actions of defense and actions of survival, and were reactions to Washington's policies and not the other way around. And when considering viable strategies and concepts of eliminating North Korea's nuclear program, attempting diplomatic relations to reverse this trend should at least be on the table and should be discussed as our larger project. And as a next step from the diplomacy side, we will look into ways to, one, improve such diplomatic relations, and the other major approach that was concluded as a class, as a viable option, is to improve the treaties that we have with our allies in the region, and eventually try to achieve a multilateral defense treaty that would strengthen that bond in the region, and that would prevent Japan and South Korea from trying to develop their own nuclear.
Like an East Asian NATO.
Correct. That's where the diplomacy group is as of now, and we're happy for any questions.
So who are the other members of your group? Oh.
We decided that it would be most efficient to have two representatives to present the material.
Okay.
All right, last group.
Thank you.
There's
Two more.
Oh, you're two groups.
Two more.
now.
Yeah.
Okay.
Signatures as cover weapons.
Oh, right. Yes. Sorry, I thought you were going to finally schedule
Give your names before you speak, please. Amen.
Sorry, folks.
So Willie Mays is involved in this North Korean program?
We need to catch that. All right, I'm Morgan.
I'm Daniela.
I'm Jacob.
Marie.
Mitchell. So we're looking at the signatures of covert weapons. Discussing with the weapons designer and the monitoring.
Rhonda is not
She has to step out earlier.
She had to leave.
So the two other groups are much more technical focused, and we thought it would be more beneficial and additive if we focus on a non-technical scope. So things like motivations and coordinations that aren't technical in nature. And so what that looks like in our actual exploration of it is we first consider a historical context. So what were the settings and motivations for previous covert programs? What were they like in South Korea?
in Japan and what has forced other programs to go from covert to overt. And hopefully that provides kind of an understanding of what the key markings are that cause the covert program to exist. And then a political setting, kind of what's the American precedent that they set to prevent covert programs. So are their actions reasonable in quelling fears, and what's the credibility for that? And those are in the responses to North Korean incidents, as well as Chinese and the interactions with South Korea and Japan.
So one of the things that we were looking at was the history of both Japanese and South Korean nuclear programs, kind of to give us an idea of looking into the future, what were the motivations, what were the signals, and what we could do kind of to detect and find out more about these programs. So when looking into this, on here we were looking into the North Korean covert program. And I think they mentioned it earlier, there was a big push in the 70s by South Korea to develop a covert nuclear weapons program. And what we're finding was the South Koreans could not develop it on their own and entered into talks with both the French and the Canadians to get nuclear technologies, which is how the United States came and gathered the knowledge of this covert program. And kind of what that indicated to us was that the South Koreans didn't have the technology to develop this technology on their own, but had to rely on other nuclear powers to get this technology. That was obviously kind of quashed later and ended up with the South Koreans entering into the Non-Proliferation Treaty. What's not on here also, because we forgot to put it in, was the Japanese nuclear program. As far as I know, Japan didn't try to build a covert nuclear weapons program, but from the research that we were finding is there is a lot kind of concern that Japan, if they wanted to, could develop a nuclear program based on the nuclear technology they have now. There's lots of concerns that with the stockpile of nuclear plutonium, the fuels that they have, if they wanted to, they could develop nuclear weapons, besides the fact that we have treaties in place. And so our future research of that is going to continue to dig in to kind of unclassify government documents to kind of see what other indications we had for past programs and how that could be applied looking into the future.
So I looked at this from more of a comparative perspective, where I took a look at the covert programs in Iran, Israel, and India, and how the U.S. responded to each one of these programs. Iran, the most current one that's been in our perspective in terms of American politics, has been the U.S.'s participation in the JCPOA, which was a negotiation ultimately with Iran to ensure their peaceful nuclear weapons program, and I analyzed what that process really looked like. And then, which is really in contrast to how the US, UK, and Israel, how Israel's nuclear weapons program has not really been acknowledged by the US. And then also India's as well. So really looking at how these three countries, how their nuclear weapons programs are treated by the US, and what potentially how the US would treat the nuclear weapons programs in both Japan and South Korea, and using past situations as precedent for the future.
And so based on these case studies, there's a RAND study about basically that there's a predictive framework that you can use on the non-technical side that surrounds human capital. So a lot of the covert programs shared similar themes with the fact that like scientific personnel, their research had incongruities with what was actually happening in their country, that this wasn't found out until later, and issues with who was working to build facilities with them. So on the recommendation side for policies, it's essentially having their nuclear scientific personnel attend regular international conferences and then checking up on that research to make sure that the research that's been done is what's expected in that time frame, and that you can confirm that it's actually happened. And then trying to gather extended data about indigenous versus foreign workers to see if, well, are they only using people of their own land so that they can potentially keep a more secretive plan.
So following up on what the military strategy was talking about relationships and how that can foster a sense of cohesion between the nations. So we're looking at how the U.S. has their political support, how the support is being perceived to actions that North Korea is taking. So especially moving from the alliance where they were trying to build nuclear power facilities in North Korea, and then backing up that with the Bush administration and moving North Korea to the axis of evil, and how that affected U.S. and Japanese and South Korean relationships and the interplay between North Korea. Additionally, we're looking at to see if how the personal relationships of the leaders influence covert weapon program. You see, if you have a good relationship at the top level, you can kind of filter that down, saying, okay, yes, we're definitely going to engage. So we don't need to have this fostering where you get more tension on a top leader level. The covert weapons program looks a lot more attractive because you don't trust your leaders don't trust each other, and you're concerned that even though they say they're going to do it, they might not actually do it from a realistic standpoint. So effectively, we're trying to boil this into that if we explore, there's the U.S. president must change to alleviate South Korean and Japanese motivation for first strike ability to covert undertakings.
So we've been talking a lot about creating some sort of treaty that we may attempt to get either China or Russia in on. And so I've been looking primarily at the Chinese influence on the U.S., on South Korea, and Japan. So I've really been looking into the power dynamics here. Basically, historically, Japan and China have not particularly gotten along. They've got a long history of various wars and disagreements over things. So Japan definitely feels that longer term, there's a long-term threat from like the powerhouse that is China now. Now that they're building up their military, they really present both a territorial and a psychological threat, especially that they do have a nuclear program, and they are really the only nuclear power in the area. So we also are taking into account like the Chinese response to any actions that we might put forth in our policy proposal. Whether we would be able to count on the Japanese to maybe, count on the Chinese to maybe support something, or whether we would know immediately that this is something that we would have to fight them on to push through, kind of thing. So basically, we're just trying to acknowledge and incorporate those aspects, and the U.S. superiority ideals. Basically, the idea that the U.S. Is constantly underestimating how long it'll take other countries to develop programs, what sort of information, what sort of access that the U.S. has, or that the U.S. assumes that other people have. And I've been looking at the Trilateral Cooperation Secretariat, which was signed and ratified in South Korea, China, and Japan in 2010. So their attempt there, they've been meeting in trilateral meetings since 2008. However, since 2010, they've set up an official agreement that they hold every year. They have a rotating person in charge. And so this whole thing is really to stabilize effective trade, economics, and information sharing. And they're saying it's based on openness, transparency, and respect for diverse cultures. However, it's not really as simple as it may seem. They've definitely made strides to interact with each other and open a way of communication. But these strides aren't necessarily going as well as they would like because there's still continual disagreements over territorial disputes. There's a series of islands that they're discussing. But when Fukushima happened in Japan, South Korea and China did allow more economic, or remove some economic sanctions and allow further trade to get food to people. So there are channels that we can look at, just a matter of figuring out the nuances.
Okay, it's pretty much 10 minutes. So.
Yeah. Yeah, so just step forward, we have a 3-step policy on how to build up our working the policy. We're just trying to provide motivations, pinpoint specific actions the U.S. can take, and then how we implement those actions.
Next group starts setting up. Questions?
So are you talking with the diplomacy group? Because it seems like a lot of these things overlap. So just make sure that you're in communication.
Let's use planet that. Let's use planet that.
White jacket. Yeah. 10.
How about you start doing
yeah.
names, because there's
So yeah, I'll give a quick introduction while we get set up here. So we're the monitoring group. Does everybody want to say your names real quick?
Josh.
I'm Grace.
Other
Kelsey.
I'm Tim.
I'm Alex.
Pedro.
Caroline.
So obviously we have a really big group covering a lot of monitoring technologies. So what we kind of decided to do is split up into kind of two subgroups. We kind of looked at left of bang and right of bang monitoring, or pre-det and post-det. So again, we have limited time and a lot of technologies to cover. So what we kind of have looked at this as kind of a deep dive into all the different technologies available for monitoring so that we can kind of understand how those technologies work and how they might implement, or how we might implement them and inform policymakers of what's going on. So less policy at this point for us and more understanding the technologies. So I guess we get started with the pre-det side.
Yeah, so we kind of split our group up into people working on pre-detonation monitoring and then into post-detonation monitoring. So on the pre-det side, we kind of split that part into even methods to acquire material and then methods of monitoring that kind of material acquisition. And then also understanding our monitoring capabilities today, and then ways of avoiding the detection of those materials. And you'll see the different owners of each of those things listed here. So if you guys have questions about any of that, kind of our group was meant to be that you can come and talk to us about it, hopefully. So going on to the next thing, this involves uranium enrichment and plutonium processing. So the uranium enrichment methods that are around today are gas diffusion, centrifuge, which Japan has right now, but it's low capacity and efficiency, but it's starting to ramp up. In fact, both Japan and Korea, they prefer, they like the option to be able to buy cheap uranium from the facilities in France, for example, that are able to do it very efficiently. They can buy uranium very cheaply. But there has been some discussion about being able to acquire the ability to do enrichment themselves. Another option is electromagnetic separation and the laser isotope separation, which, as one of the other groups kind of stole a little bit of thunder here, but Republic of Korea has already kind of they did some experiments on that, and there was actually kind of a conflict on whether that was a violation. In terms of plutonium reprocessing, there's two methods: aqueous or hydrometallurgy, which is kind of covered under Pyrex, excuse me, and then there's pyroprocessing, which is kind of this advanced technology that's coming around. And the pyroprocessing is not yet commercialized, but it is more proliferation resistant. In terms of reprocessing, Japan does have this capability, Korea does not. So the key policy questions that come out of this: how can we help Korea with their peaceful nuclear goals, and they're reducing their need to enrich or reprocess, because currently they don't have those capabilities on a commercial scale. So how do we reduce those for them? And also, do we allow them to start to do that? Maybe we can have a joint thing where we make pyroprocessing more commercially available so that they can do that, because there's not as much of a proliferation concern. And then how do we ensure that Japan is doing these things for peaceful purposes? And then also, should we monitor the import, export, and use of this material for peaceful purposes? So these are all things that we're going to be delving into a little bit more.
This is Caramel.
Yes, thank you. So there's a group called the Nuclear Suppliers Group, and it's a group that was started in 1974 after the detonation of a nuclear device by a non-nuclear weapon state. And we realized that we really need to keep track of where this material is and who has it. So before a transaction is made, the members have to agree that this transaction is within the acceptable use based on the members' agreements and the export control requirements of the member states. And so we're also going to look at dual-use export control, which is really interesting because it's about all of the materials that are needed for proliferation to occur, but aren't actually related to nuclear materials. It could be anything like steel or the screws that are actually used to build the weapon. So this can refer to any number of materials, and it would definitely be a signature of a nuclear weapons program developing.
So it's probably useful for the other subgroups to know that it is not very easy right now to detect nuclear material. Kelsey will talk a little bit as well on the next slide, but the bottom line is you generally have to be pretty close to whatever you're trying to detect. There are some longer range technologies that are being developed right now. They're still in a pretty early stage. However, publicly stating and pouring funding into these kinds of things can be part of a policy decision on our part. And then the other piece to understand is that even if you do have the means to detect, it's really easy and more importantly, really cheap to deceive them. So, a $20 HEPA filter can completely undo a multi-million-dollar uranium detection facility. So.
Yeah, just expanding on that a little bit. Special nuclear materials like highly enriched uranium and plutonium, those type of things do emit neutrons and gamma rays, but like Josh said, they're very hard to detect unless you're like right next to them. However, there are a couple of technologies that are being researched and that are actually used right now. One that I was looking into is a fast neutron imaging detector for the detection of SNN in seawater, because one of the big concerns is the transportation of these materials, and this can often happen in a sea container that's being transported between country to country, and so that's kind of the premise of that technology. Another detection technology that I looked into, which we actually use now, is the Cargo Advanced Automated Radiography System, CARS, and they actually have that in San Diego, and that's just for detecting high density material that comes in and out of ports.
So a little bit more unconventional in trying to monitor like all this technological issues and technologies is how does North Korea keep its program running even with the economic sanctions that, for example, the other team already explained. North Korea lives on a deficit. They import more than they export for several decades now. So how do they do this? Well, they do it through black markets, and lately they've been doing it through cryptocurrency trading. Also, there's been a lot of us here. Report by FIR and Record Future. These two groups have been the most active, and they have stolen at least $1 billion worth of cryptocurrencies the last year, according to these sources. This is not like a set policy proposal, but for example, South Korea new regulation prohibiting anonymous accounts. This was done recently. If a lot, since cryptocurrency trading is not regulated, but a lot of governments, this could be like a good start at some point. Asymmetric pressure on the North Korea's economics. So yeah, also cybersecurity is crucial for prevention and to detect illegal money flow. And this is just a graph saying like the top one is the targeted countries more hacked, and the other one is cybersecurity spending by the United States. You can see it's growing up, and other countries should also, which are not increasing their spending, they should start doing this to prevent this kind of things. So yeah.
As far as post-detonation monitoring, we're running a little short on time here. So rather than go in depth into all of these technologies, you can see we have different people who've done a really great job of like focusing on each technology. But the big picture here is that we have both a relatively robust international capability to detect nuclear detonations underground, on the surface, in the air, or in space. And kind of each of these technologies focus on those different detonation regimes. So of course, when it comes to detonation monitoring, one of our main concerns is what some of the other groups have gone into as well with covert programs or maybe covert detonations. So the bigger concerns there are maybe decoupling of underground detonations, where you build a big cavity, detonate inside, and then kind of forego that seismic signature. Or subcritical tests. This is what the US did during the testing moratorium in the 60s, where you kind of you substitute part of your material with surrogate material, do an explosion, but you're not actually creating a nuclear detonation. And by ramping up the amount of material in there, you can start to have confidence that your weapon will work. So that's kind of the difficult areas we would think with detonation monitoring that we might want to investigate. Do you have any other?
Yeah,
we're out of time,
so.
Yeah, if everybody sends me slides, I'll put them on e-courses and then.
Great, that'd be very good.
Any questions?
That's material. Thank you.
Hey, wondering, do we?
We'll do this next.
Yeah, let's do it next time.
Let's get together.
I have uploaded rather a lot of material on e-courses, which you can look at, which includes discussions about technical nuclear forensics. It may be applicable to that stuff. Please go right ahead and use it. It's got lots of references within it.
Okay, see you in an hour.